He promised he would never leave. He said it with complete confidence, in front of everyone, on the night everything was about to fall apart. And then, before the sun came up, he had already broken that promise 3 times. That is where most people stop with Peter. That is where the story gets reduced to a lesson about weakness, about talk being cheap, about the disciple who failed when it mattered most. But that is only half the story. Because the same man who wept in the cold dark of that night would stand up weeks later in front of thousands and change the world. And the question worth asking, the one that runs through every chapter of his life, is this: what did Jesus see in Peter that Peter couldn't see in himself? To understand Peter, you have to go back before the moment Jesus ever spoke his name, back to a lake, back to a boat, back to a life that was hard and skilled and completely ordinary. Peter's real name was Simon, Simon bar Jonah Simon, son of Jonah. He grew up in the region of Galilee, in the northern part of what is now Israel. He was from a town called Bethsaida, and he worked out of Capernaum, a fishing village on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Fishing in first-century Galilee was not a quiet hobby. It was a real trade, a demanding one. You worked at night. You managed nets, boats, and weather. You sold your catch, or you didn't eat. Peter had a brother named Andrew who fished with him, and the two of them likely had some kind of established operation. Peter was also married. Scripture mentions his mother-in-law, and Jesus would later heal her. He had a family, a livelihood, and a life with weight to it. He was not looking for a rabbi. He was not standing on the shore waiting for something extraordinary. He was doing his job. And that matters, because the whole story of Peter begins not with Peter seeking, but with Jesus arriving. The Gospel of Matthew describes the moment simply. Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and Andrew casting their nets. And he said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." The text says they left their nets immediately and followed him. No long conversation is recorded, no debate, no list of conditions, just a call and a response. And from that moment, Simon's life would never look the same. Number 6. Jesus gave him a new name, almost immediately. In John's Gospel, Andrew brings his brother to Jesus, and Jesus looks at him and says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas." Cephas in Aramaic, Petros in Greek, both mean rock, Peter. It was not a name Simon had earned. It was a name Jesus was giving him in advance. A name that pointed towards something that hadn't happened yet. And that tension, the gap between who Peter was and what his name meant, would follow him for years. A rock is stable. A rock is solid. A rock does not panic. And Peter, whatever else he was not always stable. He was impulsive. He was loud. He acted before he thought. He spoke before he understood. He was the kind of man who could be completely right and completely wrong in the same conversation. Peter became one of the 3 disciples closest to Jesus. Peter, James, and John, they were the inner circle. They were the ones Jesus took to the Mount of Transfiguration, where they saw something no other disciples witnessed. They were the ones Jesus brought deeper into the garden on the night of his arrest. They were the ones who got to be closer than everyone else. And Peter, within that group, was always the first to speak. That instinct to speak first was both his greatest strength and his most consistent problem. He said things that were profound, and he said things that were embarrassing, and sometimes both happened in the span of a few minutes, but Jesus never seemed to tire of it. He never turned to Peter and said, "You ask too many questions." He never said, "Why can't you be more like the others?" Jesus engaged with Peter exactly as he was, and shaped him from there. One of the most important moments in Peter's story comes in Matthew chapter 16. Jesus and the disciples were in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asked them a question: "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The disciples gave him several answers: John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. Then Jesus made the question personal. "But who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus responded to that answer in a way that shook the air around it. He told Peter that this revelation had not come from human wisdom, it had come from the Father. And then he said something that has been discussed, debated, and built upon for 2,000 years. He said, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." He gave Peter the keys of the kingdom. He said that what Peter bound on earth would be bound in heaven, and what Peter loosed on earth would be loosed in heaven. People across different Christian traditions have read that passage very differently. Some see it as the foundation for a specific office and authority. Others see the rock as referring to Peter's confession rather than Peter himself. Others hold views somewhere in between. The text carries enormous weight, and that weight has shaped centuries of Christian history. But whatever the theological conversation, the moment itself is striking. This fisherman from Galilee, this impulsive, sometimes foolish man, was told by Jesus that he was part of the foundation of something that would outlast empires. And then, in the very next scene, Peter failed. Immediately after being called the Rock, he pulled Jesus aside. Jesus had just started explaining that he would go to Jerusalem, suffer, be killed, and rise on the third day. And Peter said, "No, never, Lord. This shall never happen to you." He was not being cruel. He was being protective. He thought he was standing up for the one he had just confessed as Messiah. And Jesus turned to him and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." The rock became a stumbling block in the space of a few verses. That is Peter. That is the contradiction at the heart of who he was. He could hear something profound from God, and then immediately follow it with something rooted in human thinking. He wasn't evil. He wasn't trying to undermine Jesus. He was afraid. He was reacting from love and fear at the same time. And Jesus corrected him sharply, not to humiliate him, but because what Peter said in that moment was genuinely dangerous. There is a story in Matthew 14 that most people know, even if they only know the beginning. The disciples were on a boat in the middle of the night, fighting a storm. And then they saw something moving across the water toward them. They thought it was a ghost, and they were terrified. Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." And Peter, being Peter, said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Peter climbed out of the boat. He stepped onto the water. He walked. The text says he walked on the water toward Jesus, and then he noticed the wind. He looked around at the storm instead of at Jesus, and he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt?" They got into the boat, and the wind died down, and the disciples worshipped. That story is often told as a story about failure. But notice what Peter did that no one else in the boat did. He got out. He asked. He stepped onto the water and actually walked. His faith was not nothing. It was enough to get him there. What broke it was looking at the storm instead of keeping his eyes on Jesus. And Jesus didn't let him drown. He caught him. He asked the question, "Why did you doubt?" Not with contempt, but with something closer to grief. The night before Jesus was crucified, Peter sat at the table with the others. Jesus told them that they would all fall away because of what was about to happen. Peter pushed back immediately. "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." He meant it. He was not performing confidence for the room. He believed what he was saying. Jesus looked at him and told him something he didn't want to hear. "This very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter said it more strongly. Even if he had to die with Jesus, he would never disown him. All the other disciples said the same thing. A few hours later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to stay awake and keep watch while he prayed. He came back and found them asleep. He woke Peter specifically. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He went away again. He came back again. They were asleep again. This happened 3 times. And there is something painful about that. Peter could not stay awake for Jesus in the garden, and within hours, Peter could not speak up for Jesus in the courtyard. When the soldiers and officials came to arrest Jesus, Peter acted without thinking. He drew a sword and cut off the ear of a servant of the high priest. His name was Malchus. Peter wasn't being cowardly in that moment. He was being reckless. He was ready to fight for Jesus, but Jesus stopped him. "Put your sword away." And Jesus healed the man's ear. The story of Peter is full of these moments where his instincts were sincere, but his understanding was incomplete. The disciples scattered. Jesus was taken, and Peter followed at a distance. He made his way to the courtyard of the high priest's house, where Jesus was being questioned inside. He stood near a fire, warming himself in the cold night, and there, in 3 separate exchanges, he denied ever knowing Jesus. A servant girl said he had been with Jesus. He said he didn't know what she was talking about. Someone else identified him as one of the group. He denied it again. An hour later, someone else pointed out his Galilean accent as proof he was one of them. He said he didn't know the man, and the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Luke's Gospel records that moment. Jesus was somewhere in that courtyard, and when the rooster crowed, Jesus turned. They made eye contact. The text says Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him, and he went outside and wept bitterly. Not tears of embarrassment, not regret over getting caught. Bitter weeping, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you have just done. There is a detail in John's Gospel that is easy to miss. At the trial, at the arrest, there was a charcoal fire burning. The Greek word used is specific anthrakia, a charcoal fire. That is the same Greek word used later in John chapter 21, when Jesus is standing on the shore after the resurrection, and there is a charcoal fire burning on the beach. The same word. John chose it carefully. When Peter came to that beach and smelled that fire, he would have known exactly where he was emotionally. On the morning of the resurrection, 2 disciples ran to the tomb, John and Peter. John arrived first. He stood outside and looked in. Peter ran straight past him and went in. He saw the burial cloths lying there, the cloth that had covered Jesus' face folded separately. The text says that Peter saw and did not yet understand what had happened. There is something quietly human about that he was standing inside the evidence of the resurrection, and he couldn't make sense of it yet. The risen Jesus appeared to the disciples multiple times over the 40 days before the ascension, but the exchange that changed everything for Peter happened back at the Sea of Galilee. Several disciples, including Peter, had gone back to fishing. They were out all night and caught nothing. In the morning, a figure stood on the shore and called out to them, "Cast the net on the other side." They did, and the net filled. John recognized Jesus first. And Peter, hearing it was the Lord, wrapped his outer garment around himself and jumped into the water to get there faster. Jesus had a charcoal fire going, bread and fish. Come and have breakfast. He fed them. And then, when the meal was done, he turned to Peter. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Notice he called him Simon, the name before the new name, before the rock. Back to who he was at the beginning. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." He asked again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Take care of my sheep." And a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved by the third question. He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." 3 questions, 3 answers, 3 denials answered one by one at a charcoal fire at dawn by a lake. Jesus was not rubbing Peter's nose in the failure. He was restoring him publicly, point by point. He was giving Peter back the thing Peter had broken, not through performance, not through a long process of earning trust back, but through love openly declared. And then Jesus told Peter something. When you are old, someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. The tradition of the early church understood this as a reference to the way Peter would die. Then Jesus said the same two words he had spoken 3 years earlier on this same shore. Follow me. Something shifted in Peter after that morning. The man who had spent years being the biggest voice in the room and the most inconsistent became something steadier. Not perfect, not without his own stumbles, but directed, purposeful. He had been restored by the one person whose opinion meant everything, and now he understood something about himself and about Jesus that he hadn't fully understood before. 50 days after Passover, on the day of Pentecost, the disciples were gathered in Jerusalem. Something happened that is difficult to describe. Simply the Spirit of God came upon them in a way they had not experienced before. They began to speak in other languages, and the people of Jerusalem heard them speaking in their own native tongues. A crowd gathered, confused. Some mocked them, and Peter stood up. The fisherman from Galilee, the man who had denied knowing Jesus in a courtyard weeks earlier, stood up in front of a crowd of thousands and began to speak. His sermon is recorded in Acts chapter 2. He explained what they were seeing. He quoted from the prophet Joel. He spoke about David. He made the case, clearly and directly, that the Jesus who had been crucified was both Lord and Messiah. When the crowd heard this, the text says they were cut to the heart. They asked what they should do. Peter told them to repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. That day, about 3,000 people were added to the community of believers. The man who had spoken 3 denials before sunrise had now spoken a sermon that planted the early church. Peter continued to lead in ways that were bold and sometimes surprising. He and John healed a man who had been lame from birth, sitting at the gate of the temple called Beautiful. The man had been there for years, asking for money. Peter looked at him and said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." And the man walked. The crowd was astonished. Peter turned that moment into another proclamation, and another few thousand people came to believe. He was arrested. He was threatened by the same authorities who had condemned Jesus. He stood before them and said, "Whether it is right in God's sight to listen to you rather than God, you can judge for yourselves. But we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard." This was not the man who had shivered by a fire and said he didn't know anyone. This was a man who had been somewhere that changed him at the root. One of the most significant turning points in the early church involved Peter and a vision. In Acts chapter 10, while he was praying on a rooftop, Peter saw something like a large sheet coming down from heaven, filled with animals, including animals that Jewish law considered unclean. A voice told him to kill and eat. He refused. The voice said, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times. Then messengers arrived at his door, sent by a Roman centurion named Cornelius, a Gentile who had been told in a vision to send for Peter. Peter went. He sat in the house of a Gentile, which was something a faithful Jew was not supposed to do. He heard Cornelius describe his vision. And Peter said something that was not small. "I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right." He preached the gospel, and while he was still speaking, the Spirit of God came upon the Gentiles in the room visibly, undeniably. And Peter said, "Surely no one can stand in the way of their being baptized with water." The gospel had moved beyond the boundary Peter had always assumed was a boundary. This wasn't a smooth transition for Peter. Paul's letter to the Galatians records a confrontation in Antioch where Peter had been eating with Gentile believers, something the encounter with Cornelius had freed him to do. But when certain people arrived from Jerusalem, Peter pulled back and separated himself, afraid of their reaction. Paul called him out publicly for this. He said Peter was being hypocritical, that his behavior was not in line with the truth of the gospel, Peter is not recorded responding. But the fact that Paul mentions it tells us something important. Peter was not finished growing. He was still a man in process. Toward the end of his life, Peter wrote 2 letters, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. They are not the letters of the impulsive man from the Gospels. They are letters of a man who has been through things: suffering, persecution, fear, restoration. He wrote to people facing hardship and told them, "Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you." He wrote about the living hope of resurrection. He wrote about the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone. He had become, in some real sense, the person his name pointed toward, a steadying voice for people who were afraid. The New Testament does not record the end of Peter's life directly, but the early church, from the 2nd century onward, consistently held that Peter went to Rome, that he led the community of believers there, and that he was executed under the Emperor Nero, likely around the mid-60s of the 1st century. The tradition says he was crucified, and that at his own request, he was crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. That detail cannot be verified from the New Testament text, but it has been received and honored by Christians across many centuries. Jesus had said to him near the end of their breakfast by the lake that when Peter was old, someone else would lead him where he didn't want to go. The early church heard that as a reference to martyrdom. And Peter, who had once run from a servant girl's question by a fire, apparently walked toward that death with intention. So what do we do with Peter? How do we hold all of this together, the impulsiveness, the confession, the sinking, the denial, the restoration, the courage, the inconsistency, the letters, the death? What is the actual shape of this man's life? He was not a hero in the simple sense. He was not consistently brave or consistently wise. He made enormous promises and broke them before morning. He received profound truth and almost immediately turned it into a stumbling block. He saw Jesus walk on water, touched the hem of a glorified Christ on a mountaintop, ate breakfast with a risen man on a beach, and still struggled to live in a straight line between what he believed and what he did. That is not a comfortable story, but it is an honest one, and yet Jesus chose him. Not despite the failures, exactly, but with full knowledge of them. Before the denials happened, Jesus told Peter they would happen. He saw it coming. And he also saw what would come after. When you have turned back, Jesus told him at the Last Supper, strengthen your brothers. Not if you turn back. When? He knew the failure was coming. He also knew the restoration was coming. There is something in that worth sitting with. Jesus gave Peter a name that meant rock before Peter had proven he was one. He called him the foundation before the foundation had been tested. And in the end, through the testing, through the failure, through the restoration, Peter became the thing the name described. Not because he was exceptional from the beginning, but because Jesus did not walk away when Peter failed. The open loop from the beginning of this story was, why Peter? Why this man impulsive, inconsistent, prone to failure at the worst possible moments? Why was he the one Jesus pointed to as the rock? Why was he the one who stood up and preached at Pentecost? Why was he the first voice of the early church? One answer is that Peter's very humanness was the point. The church Jesus was building was not for people who had already figured it out. It was not for the spiritually perfect or the theologically complete. It was for the broken, the afraid, the impulsive, the people who made promises and didn't keep them, the people who had wept bitterly over their own failures. And the man leading them needed to be someone who had stood in all of that and been found, caught, and restored. There is a moment in Luke's Gospel where Jesus tells Peter something during the Last Supper conversation, almost as an aside. He says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Peter did not fully understand what was coming. He still made the promises he couldn't keep. But Jesus had already prayed for him. That was already in place. The foundation of Peter's story was not Peter's strength. It was Jesus' prayer. Peter's life teaches several things that don't require a neat summary. It teaches that calling comes before character is complete. It teaches that failure is not the final word when Jesus is still speaking. It teaches that restoration is not just emotional repair, it is recommissioning. Being forgiven and being sent are part of the same moment. It teaches that the most human people, the ones with the most visible contradictions, are sometimes the ones who carry the most hope to other broken people, because they have no illusion of being anything other than what they are. He started as a fisherman on a lake. He ended as a voice that echoed across the ancient world. He was afraid and brave. He was wrong and right. He sank and he walked. He denied and he proclaimed. He was called a rock before he was one, and became one because he was never left alone in the process. The man who wept by a fire and the man who stood at Pentecost are the same man. And that is the point. That is what makes Peter worth knowing, not because his story is clean, but because it is true.